with your extra credit opportunities, make sure that you're getting those done this week, right? Because next week things are going to be chaotic with finals, etc. And it'd be just nice to have those done and submitted. You don't know for sure whether you're going to need it, but it only helps, right? And so you don't know whether you're going to end up on the edge of a grade. And as you'll notice in the syllabus, our grades are 90, 80, 70, 60. So if you get to a 89.3 or something like that, that's a great grade. That is a B though. So I don't do any rounding or anything. That's why I do the extra credit opportunities. So make sure I would just do them. And that way you know going in, if you have them done, and I'll try to get them recorded and stuff like that. I try to do it each time we have an exam. I try to get those updated. But that way you can see that those will kind of have you up as high as you can be leading into exam 4, leading into the final, etc. Okay? Lab practical on Wednesday. That one in lab today we're just reviewing. And then we'll just have the practical on Wednesday. So review and lecture on Wednesday, lab practical on Wednesday. Okay. Other things? Just look over your assignments. Make sure you're not missing things. There might be an end of the semester survey or something like that as well. That might be worth a couple of points. So do that as well. There's one that is, for me, that is one that's just like, hey, how did it go? What are things that you could, suggestions to improve? And then I think there might be an official school one as well. So
there's also the I Belong one.
Yes, so the I Belong one. I think people have already started submitting that. Have you guys seen that? It gets sent to your Maricopa email? Okay, so that one, because we're part of the I Belong program, they like to have feedback on that program where you could have borrowed a school iPad for the semester. So fill that one out regardless. So even if you didn't borrow one, let them know that, because that gives them significant feedback as to what the need is and the use is and stuff like that. They started during COVID when there was a big need, and maybe there's less and less of a need, but that way they can tailor that program for the needs that students have right now. And then I think at the end of that, there's a, thank you for completing. You want to screenshot that, and that's what you can upload to the iPad I Belong survey, showing that you completed it. Not anything the answer, just that you did it. Okay? Yeah?
Do you remember when we have to turn the iPads back in?
That is an excellent question. I will try to go through my emails. It should be the end of next week.
They think it's the 10th, suggested the 10th.
Yeah, so 10th is Friday. So yeah. That would align. Usually they try to, it was kind of silly. In the early parts of the program, they wanted them back like the beginning of finals week. You're like, bless you. That's exactly when everybody needs them. That's when they're going to be using them the most is, kind of taking final assessments and studying and stuff like that. So we got them to push it till the end of the week.
That's a good adjustment.
Yeah. So, other things. All right. Okay. We'll get back into it. So this is where we stopped last time. And what we're going to do is we'll find that there are only a handful of slides left for the reproductive system chapter, notably the female part. And then we have a separate PowerPoint for development. And there is a chapter in your book, whether your e-textbook or, bless you, your other textbook, for development. And while I always encourage you guys to look at the tables and the figures and possibly read the chapter, etc., in that case, it's kind of up to you with development, because we're right at the end there. What I always say is that what you see in the PowerPoint that we'll be going over today for development is all that you need to know for any question that may relate to development on our last exam. So I wouldn't worry about, if you want to, you want to look at other figures or something like that, that's totally fine. But you don't have to worry about, like reinforcing the content with a bunch of other detail. They may add some extra stuff that just might be overwhelming at this point. So whatever you see in the slides are the things you would need to know for development. So I do have a couple other figures relating to this at the beginning of that PowerPoint that we're going to be going through. So I'll just touch on this briefly, and then we'll go through the details of it again in that other PowerPoint in just a couple minutes. But one of the things that we want to highlight is that we need to know these two cycles, right? The ovarian cycle, the different phases that are occurring in the ovary, as well as the uterine cycle. We need to know them both. And there are 1, 2, 3 different phases in the ovarian cycle, and 1, 2, 3 different phases in the uterine cycle. Okay? So for those, we need to know the names of them. We need to be able to describe what's going on during each of those, right? You got to be able to describe it. It's like the usual thing. It's like the anatomy and physiology. We got to say what it is, name it, and then we got to say what it does, what's going on in there, right? So have an adequate description, about what's going on in the organ during those phases. And then finally, the other thing we have to tie together is that all of these are hormonally controlled. And this is where we're kind of seeing this overlap between endocrine system and reproductive system. We had kind of put off some of these hormones like the effects of progesterone and estrogen and stuff like that out of the endocrine chapter, knowing we were going to come up to it here. In general, the pituitary gland, think about to a certain extent, kind of the anatomical layout of it, right? The pituitary is going to be the boss of all this. Technically, the hypothalamus is the big boss, right? Hypothalamus to pituitary down to the ovaries communicating with the uterus, okay? So that kind of hierarchy exists in terms of controlling these different cycles. So what that means is the hormones from the pituitary gland are what are controlling the ovarian cycle. The hormones from the ovary are what are controlling the uterine cycle, okay? So that's kind of the tiered level approach of control and coordination of these cycles. Okay, so like I said, I do have a couple of other figures coming up in the other PowerPoint that we'll get to in just a few minutes. So rather than going through this one that we already did at the end of last time, I'll wait to review the details of these two cycles with those figures coming up. Okay? But before we do that, in case you would come here with burning questions from your weekend about it, did you have things that you wanted me to review before I move on from that, before we finish up the reproductive chapter? Okay, we'll save that to when we do the review, like I said, in just a few minutes. And then we can see kind of where the questions may still lie after we do that detailed review. All right, so at the end of this chapter, we have just a few topics, right? So we had gone through oogenesis, which was a more complicated topic having to do with the reproductive system, right? The production of the gametes and going through the 2 meiotic divisions and things like that. That was a bigger topic in this chapter. And then like the male reproductive system, we also went through and talked about the different organs and how they contribute to the reproductive function, supporting the gametes often, or transporting them, or protecting them, or something like that. And then we also, like in the male reproductive system, we talked about how we have testosterone coming from the gonads, and how testosterone comes from the interstitial cells. It has a role in terms of influencing gametogenesis within those gonads, but it also has kind of effects, secondary effects throughout the body too. And we saw that there is a periodicity, different times when testosterone levels go up and down. Now in the male, those are really long, right? So there's an initial spike to develop in utero, the male reproductive system. A spike in release of testosterone is what signals all these other organs to develop. And then it settles down. And then there's a little bit of a spike kind of in your early year or so as the body is kind of getting up and developing and getting stronger and stuff like that. Then it goes down again. And then primarily at puberty, right, the hormone-laden period, those testosterone levels spike up really high, higher than the other ones, and continue throughout almost the reproductive lifetime of the male. So there's kind of 3 different periods of testosterone spikes and then like a big plateau at the end. For female, it's going to be a monthly cycle in addition to an initial rise in estrogen in the beginning there where the gonads have developed. All right, so you're still going to see that estrogen levels rise overall during puberty, kind of like in the males, but we'll see monthly periods of time when it's going to increase and decrease as well. So it's still going to have, like the steroid hormones in the male, anabolic effects on the female reproductive tract. So like we mentioned, especially during puberty, all of these different female reproductive organs are going to grow larger. The vaginal mucosa thickens and the external genitalia mature as well. There's the growth of the breasts, more deposition of subcutaneous fat, particularly at the hips and the breasts, even the mons pubis, widening and lightening of the pelvis, because we're preparing that pelvis, that bony bowl, if you will, for the possibility of developing an embryo and then a fetus, and then being able to release it as well. And then the growth of axillary and pubic hair. Now, in terms of the female sexual response, we saw in the male sexual response where there was the blood flow to the erectile tissues of the penis, the emission, the release of the gametes from the epididymis into the vas deferens and transporting along those tubes, adding in of the fluids along the way. Seminal vesicles add in their solution, prostate gland adds in solution, vulvourethral gland maybe a little bit before, a little bit during as well, and then ejaculation. So that was leading to the deposition of the gametes into the female reproductive tract. Now, the female sexual response is somewhat similar in terms of blood flow to erectile tissue, right, to the clitoris, but also to the vaginal mucosa and even to the breasts. The vestibular glands, which we have, which are kind of analogous to the vulvourethral glands, we're going to find are secreting lubricating mucus. And then orgasm. Now in the male, the orgasm was leading from emission and ejaculation, right? Pelvic floor muscles as well as smooth muscle contractions along the tubes, getting those different gametes to move. In this case, the gamete movement in the female, right, is not necessarily coordinated with a sexual act. That ovulation is going to be occurring every month, for the most part, and that's going to be hormonally controlled, but unrelated to the sexual response. So if we're going to have a successful sexual reproduction, then hopefully those are going to be coordinated, because we need to release the egg so that it's available for the sperm to find and combine with, right? If it's still in the ovary, sperm deposited within the female reproductive tract are going to go that whole pathway, and there's not going to be anything there, right? Nobody's home. But if it is hopefully coordinated with the release of the oocyte, then they're going to meet up oftentimes in those uterine tubes. That's where fertilization is going to occur. And we're going to talk about that in the development section, like when they come together. If it arrives too late, so say ovulation occurred, but it was a number of days before intercourse, before the deposition of the sperm, then that egg is going to be picked up by the fimbriae, right? Here's my fimbriae. There's my uterine tubes, right? So it's going to be going along the uterine tubes to the uterus. It's going to arrive at the uterus too early. We know that, like when you look at those models, like the cell to embryo model, remember we saw that as it was moving along the uterine tube, it was also undergoing cleavage. It was reaching that morula stage as it was along here, and then by the time it reaches the uterus, it was now in the blastula stage, and it was ready to implant. We had cells that were going to be the embryo, that were going to be the yolk sac, that were going to be the amniotic sac, and we were starting to grow those chorionic villi, right, to start to form that attachment for the placenta. So if the egg arrived too early, maybe it does get fertilized, but maybe it gets fertilized in the uterus in here. And well, we know that these ovarian and uterine cycles are in a very tight schedule. And so we're waiting, the female body is waiting for some sort of chemical signal like pregnancy occurred. And if it's been so late that the fertilization has occurred down in the uterus, then likely we're going to be at the tipping point going into the menstrual phase, because we didn't get that signal, and now everything is going to be shed. So even though there was a successful fertilization, there's not a successful pregnancy, because the embryo hasn't had time to develop and implant into the wall and start releasing those flare-like chemicals, letting the mother's body know that the pregnancy has occurred, and we want to maintain the uterine lining and not shift into the menstrual phase instead. Okay? Okay. So, while orgasm is certainly awesome, it's not necessarily related to our successful fertilization and pregnancy. Now, there are some benefits to it. They think that maybe, other benefits to it, let's put it that way, they think that maybe, right, the rhythmic contractions that occur, any of the rhythmic contractions that occur might help to usher the sperm cells up further, up into the upper reaches of the vagina, towards the cervix and up towards the uterus. So, possibility that there's a benefit that way, but they're kind of inconclusive on that. Okay, so organism in the female, not essential for conception, but it may contribute. And rather than like in the males where there's a refractory period, a period of time when that orgasm can't occur, and that could be minutes, it could be hours, it could be days, it could be just like one and done, right? That changes through time as well. In females, there's not really a refractory period, so multiple orgasms in a short period of time are certainly possible. All right, so towards the end of this PowerPoint, there's a section on STDs. We're not going to actually go through those, but you should certainly in your own life be aware of them, right? Different types of viruses and bacteria, etc., that can be transmitted during unprotected sex. Now, one other thing that I do want to touch on, though, so that means, right, STDs, disease disorders of that type won't be on the lecture exam, but this section certainly could be. When we're talking about the gametes coming together, right? Remember in oogenesis and spermatogenesis, we went through this whole process of 2 rounds of meiosis in order to get down to cells that are haploid cells that only have half of the genetic material, right? They have 23 chromosomes as opposed to 46. That means 22 autosomal and 1 sex chromosome. So in the females, right, if you remember this from 181 or whatever, females, X chromosome and X chromosome. So you had an X chromosome from your dad and an X chromosome from your mom, and so females in humans are XX. Now it's different in other animals. There are certain things that are like XO, and Y ones are going to be female and stuff like that. But XX is going to be female genotype in humans. Now, when we produce gametes then, when we produce oocytes in female, what are our choices there? We have an X and we have an X. So all of the different oocytes are going to have 1 X chromosome, right? Now, in the male, in a diploid cell, we have an X and a Y chromosome as part of those 46. And when we're doing that meiotic division and we're dividing it in half, that means half of the sperm cells that we produce are going to have a Y chromosome, and the other half, the other 2 out of 4, are going to have an X chromosome, right? So that's where the 50-50 chance of having a boy or a girl comes from. Half of the sperm are going to have an X chromosome, half are going to be a Y chromosome. So the genetic and genotypic and phenotypic sex of the offspring come from the genes in the male that are contributed, okay? So half X, half Y, like that. Now there hasn't been any conclusive research saying that anything other than a 50-50 ratio would be common. There's nothing, sometimes you hear about, well, like if there's these certain conditions and it's more conducive to having a male child or a female child or whatever, but there's nothing conclusive about that. There have even been talk, right, if you look at when they have all the chromosomes lined up, right, the Y chromosome is much smaller than the X chromosome, right? So for a while there was even an idea like, oh, well, but think about this, right? So a sperm cell that has an X chromosome is carrying more genetic luggage compared to one with the Y chromosome that's smaller. So maybe it's a little bit lighter, so maybe it swims a little bit faster, maybe it gets there a little bit sooner compared to the X chromosome. But the numbers don't weigh out. So anyway, there's always areas of research that they're still interested in. But a key aspect of that Y chromosome, though, is this gene, the SRY gene. So the SRY gene is the gene that initiates testes development, that initiates the male gonad development, which then releases testosterone to masculinize and develop all of the rest of the reproductive system. Okay, so that's the key genetic component of the Y chromosome that starts the development of that male embryo along that path. Yeah.
So when they're testing like your blood to determine whether it's going to be a boy or a girl, are they looking for testosterone then? Or
So when they're testing like a pregnant woman's blood or what?
Yeah.
I don't know about that. So, right, so this is the blood type of the embryo itself, which should be kind of self-contained there.
But should you see hormone levels?
Female hormone levels, now it is possible for hormones to get across the placental barrier, right? Kind of like when we're talking about the kidney, how there's filtration that's occurring there, but there are certain small things that can pass through, and certain hormones can pass through. Maybe. I would just have to say maybe, just because I don't know for sure. Think about what we learned in terms of endocrine system. Usually, our steroid hormones, with transport, they have to have a transport protein, which makes them a bit larger, which means there would probably be a little bit less chance that they would cross the placental membrane, but there's always like a little free fraction as well, right? Where the transport protein like drops it off and now it's by itself, and so maybe even that free fraction, maybe there's enough. Maybe. We do know that testosterone in the female can come from the adrenal cortex as well. So it would have to be up and above that little bit of testosterone that's normally circulating around in the female reproductive system.
Because how else do they determine whether it's boy or girl other than ultrasound?
Yeah, otherwise, yeah. So they do sampling of the amniotic fluid, we know. I don't know, we'll have to look into it. Yeah, send me a reminder email and maybe I can look into it and see what kind of where that's coming from. It's a possibility. It tracks that we know that's in the bloodstream. Just I'm not sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a friend that just went through this actually, and she sent me the copy of what she got from the lab. So I'm going to see if I can find it because it actually said what they were looking for. I just thought about it.
Oh, good. Okay.
So
Yeah.
in like prenatal labs, they do testing for like certain chromosomes too.
Right. Yeah. So that's the other thing, right? Those should be really big molecules that shouldn't be necessarily floating around. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry.
So I've heard that sperm life and how long they live is different based off of female and male. Is that true?
What do you mean based off of female and male?
Like that the males live shorter.
Oh,
The-
the sperm that is male.
Like the sperm that's male, yeah. The male sperm.
Oh, the ones that carry the Y chromosome have a different lifespan than the ones that have an X chromosome?
Right.
I don't know. I haven't heard that either. Why would that be, I wonder? Maybe areas of the X chromosome that have certain genes that are not duplicated on the Y, that are missing from the Y, that somehow support the cell function?
Well,
I
it's
don't
funny
know.
because you said like the female chromosomes have like heavier baggage, so
Right.
maybe we have more boys. My sister tried 4 times for a boy and she had 4 girls.
Yeah, I think you're the other way as well, right?
I was told I wasn't able to have kids at all, and my only pregnancy was a boy. And she's like, "How did you do that?"
I don't know. I
So
had
it's
secrets.
It's interesting because I have a lot of friends at work too that have, oh, I'm just going to try one more time because I really want either a boy or a girl, and they never have what they're like trying for.
Uh-huh.
There was one who had 7 kids and they were all boys.
Oh,
Yeah,
that would be
trying to have a
amazing.
girl.
Yeah, wait, just one more. This for sure be a girl. Come on, you gotta flip that coin one more time, right? Yeah.
I don't know why.
Okay, so I just found the message that my friend sent.
Yeah.
So the lab says, the amount of DNA present in the sample met the minimum threshold for processing. Y target male DNA was detected, indicating the baby sex is male. And it says what they do is, the methodology for it is DNA extraction and amplification of the Y target DNA. So they're actually looking for the Y chromosome.
Where are they pulling that blood from?
She just had, I don't
Yeah.
know, because she just had like a blood test, like a normal blood test. So I don't know, but
Right? What?
There's non-invasive prenatal testing. So, yeah, just regular blood tests.
yeah. They came to her house, they drew her blood, and a
So
week
just
later,
DNA, just loose DNA, just like
they're
bouncing
somehow
around.
able to like
There's
target
certain
markers
markers
that they look for.
Right, but like you wouldn't think that would necessarily be floating around in the blood. All that's
I
supposed to
know.
be inside the nucleus, inside the cell, like double packaged.
Yeah, it's
Isn't,
really
isn't
weird.
it wild how much science doesn't know about females?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
oh,
Oh, the body overall for sure, let alone females,
Why
yeah.
haven't we been studying this? You know, society, I mean. Society.
Yeah. Okay, so as we were talking about, we were getting to sexual maturity when all this is going to happen. And so in both cases, with those increases in sex hormones, we see those secondary sexual characteristics appearing as we've been talking about, right? So those are going to be, if you will, signals, external signals that say that the male or female body is in a state when reproduction and gametogenesis could occur. Okay. Lastly, so we talk about the getting to a state when reproduction to occur. In males, we find that there's not really a male menopause, right? So those testosterone levels stay high. Generally, those gametocytes or gametogenesis is going to continue on. But in females, somewhere, it kind of varies between others, right? Somewhere in the 50s, likely, there's going to be a decrease in these cycles. Now, it's a whole control cycle that we're about to go and review again. But that means that this feedback cycle is going to slow down. We know that, the pituitary gland is putting out follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, but that relies on a whole feedback mechanism. So somewhere along the way, if maybe, is it the hormone not causing ovulation and the release of the egg anymore? And so then we go get changes in estrogen and progesterone, and then we don't get the uterus doing its cycles, and that's what kind of feeds back. Is it the uterus? I don't know which part in that whole cascade of events ends up being the limiting factor. But as part of that cycle, things end up slowing down. So without the follicle-stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland, we're not going to develop any more follicles. Without a luteinizing hormone, we're not going to be releasing follicles. Then with estrogen levels, estrogen comes from the developing follicles. So if follicles aren't developing, estrogen levels are going to go down. Without the egg being released and developing the corpus luteum, progesterone levels, the main time when we have increased progesterone, that's going to go down, which means that the uterine cycle is also going to go down in terms of its changes in phases and things like that. So there are some of the secondary sexual characteristics because those hormones are going down, estrogen, progesterone as well. You may see metabolic effects, changes overall that are becoming evident as that menopause is occurring. Okay. So let's take a look, as I was discussing, about those cycles. Let's look into those cycles and review those cycles that we were just referencing, coming and slowing down and stopping. Let's review how they are when they're in full swing. All right. So again, this is some other figures that I took from different textbooks that I think do a decent job in showing this cascading effect of these different hormones, right? So we know that the ultimate boss of the whole situation is going to be the hypothalamus. And it's going to be putting out our gonadotropic releasing hormones that then tell the anterior pituitary that we see here to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, luckily, these hormones are named for their role in the female. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the growing or development of the follicles, right? From primordial to primary to secondary, etc. Luteinizing hormone, we know that we have two hormones, two gonadotropic hormones coming from the pituitary gland, from the anterior pituitary, but we have three phases, right? We have a follicular phase, we have ovulation, and then we have a luteal phase. So we have three ovarian phases, but we only have two hormones that are controlling them. Follicle stimulating hormone controls the first one, the follicular development. Luteinizing hormone controls both ovulation and the formation of the corpus luteum. There's a big spike and a drop in luteinizing hormone, a big surge that causes ovulation, and then there is higher levels of luteinizing hormone that are maintained in order to signal the development of the corpus luteum. right? Those follicular cells kind of come in and fill in and go from a corpus hemorrhagicum to a corpus luteum, and the luteinizing hormone helps to control that. So that's the role, right? Those are gonadotropic hormones that are coming from the anterior pituitary and coordinating the 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. All right. Questions on that? That's the first step. 3 phases of the ovarian cycle, coordinated by follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone coming from the pituitary gland. Now from there, the ovaries are going to, as we know, further develop our follicles, but that development is going to influence their release of estrogens and progesterone. Those are 2 primary sex hormones. Relaxin is another hormone that they put out that can inhibit contractions, hence the name, at different points of the cycle. Inhibin is just a feedback hormone that goes back to the hypothalamus that lets it know that it was successful in terms of getting the ovaries to go through their cycle. Okay? Bless you. Yeah.
So is it the follicles that release the estrogen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for asking that. So all along the edge here, remember when we get to our secondary and our mature follicles, now we have layers, different layers of follicular cells. We have our corona radiata in here. We have the cumulus ophorus, all these outer layers around it, but still near the oocyte. And then we have 2 different layers of cells at the edge of the follicle. Our granulosa cells on the inside towards the antrum, and then our theca cells towards the outside. Those cells that are along the edge of the follicle are the ones that are creating and releasing estrogen. So as that follicle develops, as we get more of those follicular cells and the follicle gets bigger, those estrogen levels are going to go up because now we have the cells that make the estrogen. So the follicular development is what causes the estrogen levels to go up because that's where the estrogen is coming from. It's coming from those larger follicles that have gotten bigger and have those granulosa and theca cells like that. So the progesterone and a little bit of estrogen is coming from the corpus luteum, that group of cells, but primarily that estrogen in the early stages are coming from those growing follicles. All right, so then let's take it one step further. So here, right, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone telling the ovary what to do. Follicle-stimulating hormone handles follicular phase. Luteinizing hormone handles ovulation and the luteal phase, the formation and maintenance of the corpus luteum. All right, so we have that. Now we add the next level, the next tier, if you will. So estrogens, which are coming from the ovary, are responsible for the proliferative phase, where we're building back that endometrium. And again, this is what we're seeing here. This is the thickness of the endometrium right here. Okay? There's our stratum functionalis on top of our stratum basalis, right? So the estrogens that are coming from those mature follicles is causing the endometrium to build back. And we see the different uterine glands forming and the increased vascularization of that endometrium, etc. Then, as we get towards the second half of that 28 days, what we have is the corpus luteum is formed up in the ovary. It's going to be releasing mainly progesterone, a little bit of estrogen, and that is what causes our secretory phase, where those uterine glands are now secreting a lot of glycoproteins and things like that for the, hopefully, embryo that's going to be showing up soon. And so progesterone levels from the corpus luteum is causing that secretory phase. So when we have a nice big corpus luteum, functional corpus luteum, yellow body, it's secreting a lot of progesterone, which is making a nice supportive endometrium for a potential pregnancy. Now, if that pregnancy doesn't occur, which in most cases it doesn't, right? What's going to happen is, again, the mother's body, the potential mother's body, the female's body, is listening for chemical signals that a pregnancy occurred. When that doesn't happen, as it doesn't happen in most months, then without that feedback, then what's going to happen is that corpus luteum is going to degenerate into a corpus albicans. right? It's going to basically start dying off. That means progesterone levels are going to drop. What was maintaining our endometrium? High progesterone levels. So if those progesterone levels drop, then the endometrium is going to tip over and basically shed, right? It's going to kind of undergo apoptosis and degenerate. The blood vessels are going to break apart, and we're going to get rid of that stratum functionalis, and we're going to go into the menstruation phase. So again, what we see here is that there are two different hormones, estrogens and progesterone, that are handling three phases. Estrogen is responsible for the proliferative phase. Progesterone is responsible for the secretory phase when it's high, and then the menstrual phase when it's low, right? So technically, progesterone is handling two of those. When we have a lot of progesterone, we maintain the endometrium in the secretory phase, but when the corpus luteum goes away and those progesterone levels drop, then we enter into the menstrual phase instead. So it's those sex hormones that are coming from the ovary that are bossing around or communicating with the uterus to make sure that these two organs are in sync or in cycle with one another to potentially support pregnancy every month. Okay? So 3 uterine phases coordinated by these two hormones coming from the ovary. So you got to know which hormone controls which of the phases, and then be able to describe them a little bit as well. And it's kind of in the names, right? Cells of the endometrium is proliferating and growing back, and we're forming these different uterine glands during the proliferative phase. You can call it the pre-ovulatory phase. I don't, but you can. That's what's going on up in the ovary, right? That's before ovulation is when this proliferative phase is occurring. And then secretory phase is also known as the post-ovulatory phase. So it's up to you. You can use either one. But you got to be able to describe what's going on in that organ and the hormone responsible for it. Okay? Question? Every month there's this dance and pattern of getting these things ready for a possible pregnancy. Most months it doesn't occur. We reset the clock. We develop more follicles again. We build back the endometrium and get ready for a possibility the next month. Yeah.
So if on birth control,
Yeah.
what part of this is interrupted?
Yeah, so that's always a good question, a very interesting question. So on hormonal birth control, because there's lots of different types of birth control, right? For the most part, birth control goes into different categories of, okay, most of them is just like, let's keep the gametes separate, right? Now, the broadest form of that is just keeping the genitalia separate. And then there's no delivery and the gametes aren't going to get together. That's certainly a way to do it. Otherwise, there's barriers and stuff like that. But chemical or hormonal is going to be, what's going to happen is, in a pregnancy, and this is what we're going to talk about coming up, that corpus luteum is going to stay. So there's going to be a chemical feedback that comes actually from the embryo and some of the embryonic tissue. It releases a hormone, like I said, like a flare gun saying, hey, I'm here. It's called HCG. We're coming up to it. And if that hormone gets into the mother's circulation, it feeds back to the cycle, right back to the hypothalamus and all this trickle down, and the corpus luteum is going to be maintained. As long as the corpus luteum is keeping up those progesterone levels, then the endometrium is going to stay that way, and we're in this pregnancy phase, and we're not doing menstruation, and we're not doing more follicular development. We're in a pause, okay? So what's mainly in those daily tablets or the injection or the ring or whatever? Progesterone. You keep those progesterone levels high, then the uterus is like, I guess something's on the way, so we're going to keep the endometrium. And the feedback mechanism is going to keep those follicles from continuing to develop, and it's going to keep ovulation from occurring. So if there's no egg that's released, any sperm that are on the pathway looking to fertilize something, there's nothing there. So it's just preventing that ovulation through a feedback mechanism. You're tricking the female body into thinking that it's in this pregnancy phase.
But some people still have the menstruation part, the shedding of the lining part, so that doesn't affect the.
Because you do the pseudo ones, like you stop.
Oh, you have that week of.
So that's the other part of it, right? So when you look at the colored pills or whatever, there's 3 weeks of a certain color pill. Those are progesterone that are going to keep those elevated levels. The other week are placebos, right? So what does that mean? When we know when the corpus luteum goes away, progesterone levels are going to drop. And when progesterone levels drop, that's what initiates menstruation, clearing out of the endometrium. So you're artificially doing that. You're keeping them high, and then you're dropping them. You're letting that extra amount that you've been putting into the system go low, and that's going to trigger menstruation. So you're kind of controlling it, you're manipulating it with external hormones instead.
Like I've had friends tell me that they still have menstruation on the IUD, and so that doesn't have, you're not taking anything differently on that.
Right,
So-
right. So in some of the other devices, right, there's no messing with the chemicals and things like that, and so these cycles will kind of go through.
It's interesting.
Yeah, different ways at kind of getting to the end point there. All right. So there's all of our different phases. This is just another one that I copied from a different textbook that, again, overlays. This one, the reason I include this one is it has these two panels to it as well, right? So we've seen the ovarian events and we've seen the uterine events on the 28-day cycle, but this shows us those hormonal concentrations. And so we can see towards the beginning here that follicle-stimulating hormone levels are at some of their highest at the beginning of the ovarian cycle. So higher FSH at the beginning is what causes the follicular phase in the ovary. There's that big spike and drop of luteinizing hormone seen in yellow, which causes ovulation. And then luteinizing hormone levels are maintained at a relatively high level or higher level to maintain that corpus luteum that we see here. Then when we look down here at the hormonal concentrations of estrogen and progesterone coming from the ovary, we can see that the highest levels of estrogen are at the beginning when those follicles are developing, and those high levels of estrogen are causing our proliferative phase where we're building back that endometrium. Then, after ovulation, right, and the formation of the corpus luteum, we see how, in green here, our progesterone levels are at some of their highest points, and that is what is causing our secretory phase of the uterine cycle as well. And so when those are maintained at high levels, we're maintaining the endometrium. When those levels drop, like we see here, then shortly thereafter, we're going to go into the menstruation phase instead. So that just kind of shows us some of those hormonal levels and how they coordinate with the phases of what's going on in these cycles as well. Yeah?
This is sort of random, but as an adult, like after high school, and there were girls on my gymnastics team that would take birth control to stop their period. So they wouldn't take the placebo, they would
Just maintain the high progesterone levels.
Can that affect you negatively?
Sure, it can, right? Because there's a natural cycle to it.
Yeah, nothing's like, you're never shedding that. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't think about it then. I never took it, but they just didn't want to deal with
So
that.
I actually do that, and the doctor said that it's fine. Like I've had multiple doctors tell me that it wouldn't affect anything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting, but in the back of my mind, I'm always like, but science, you gotta go through those phases.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a natural variation to it that you're kind of putting off and putting off and putting off. And so you're thinking, well, and that's, you know, and that comes into play when we think about any types of drugs that will alter the normal body function. Like we were just recently, a few of us were talking about like sleep aids and, you know, like Benadryl and melatonin and things like that. Well, melatonin that we know comes from the pineal gland is helping to coordinate the sleep and wake cycle and stuff like that. And so if you're taking melatonin regularly at night, then what's happening is you are basically taking over the role of the pineal gland. You're like, pineal gland, I got this, right? I'm going to take the melatonin. And then what happens when you go off the melatonin? The pineal gland's like, wait, like I'm back on the job now all of a sudden? And so there's this, right, this change back to hopefully what would be a normal condition. But, you know, the body is definitely resilient. It responds to changes in the environment and changes in the internal environment as well. And so there's a hope that things will go back to a normal. And when we say normal, we also know that through our time, we've been learning about how these systems should work. And we know that there's all kinds of variation in terms of how they do work, and diseases and disorders where they don't work, like, right, my nephew-in-law's pituitary tumor and stuff like that, where he's releasing all this prolactin, and that shouldn't have been like that, and so now he's taking chemicals to try to get it back to the normal state. So, but when we're taking these things for long periods of time, they do sometimes recommend that, okay, but let's see, you've been on this for a while, let's take you off of it for a while and see how things normalize. Maybe the body can handle it now again and you'll go back to a normal cycle or something like that. Or maybe you're still going to need that additional, right? For whatever reason, your body isn't putting it out still, but let's check on it every once in a while and see. So it's just kind of doing your own monitoring about how the body is doing. Yeah.
So if you're on the pill and you're taking that progesterone, and then you take the placebo and you get back on, you're basically not allowing that follicle to be ovulated, right?
Right.
You're preventing ovulation,
Yeah.
but the uterine lining is again reestablished.
Yeah. So it's been So when you're talking about like going on to the next cycle of those pills, yeah.
Yeah, so your uterine lining replenishes, but there was no ovulation, so there's no egg released.
Right.
But then you're continuing to shed that lining every month by taking the placebo.
Right. Yeah.
Not taking the placebo would just continue that lining.
Right? It would maintain that the whole time. So yeah, you would see more of a change in cycle of the uterus that approximates the normal, but the ovarian cycle will be kind of inhibited. Yeah.
So if you don't have the ovulation,
Yeah.
do those do they turn into corpus albicans? Like they die off because they're not being released? Or do they just all stay in the ovaries?
So likely that whole cascade that we were seeing here, right, is going to be stunted. And so we won't have follicle stimulating hormone coming down and telling the follicles to develop from primordial to primary to secondary.
So they just stay.
So they just stay. So they're there. So later on in life, and somebody had actually asked that question. So if you were on the pill for a long time and you weren't ovulating eggs, that means like later on in life, you've got more eggs left over. So does that mean it extends things in terms of your menopause? I haven't heard anything about that. Like menopause is put off because you actually have some more eggs. I don't know that whole cycle in terms of what's the shortcoming there. Is it a hormonal issue, like the hormones basically are simmering down, but the ovary was like, I still got some, or is it the eggs? Because they're old as well, right? So, as things are older, things tend to degenerate a bit. So I don't know. That's the other thing we think about it too. Last thing is that if we're thinking about these cycles, right? If the follicles aren't developing, we said that it's a secondary and a mature follicle that is going to be releasing estrogens. So if we're not developing follicles, does that mean in somebody who's taking birth control that the estrogen levels are abnormally low? Because we're not developing the follicles. Progesterone's high, estrogens are maybe a little bit lower. Now there are some estrogens that come out of the corpus luteum, but not quite as high as what we see coming out of the mature follicles. So maybe those are high enough to maintain metabolism and stuff like that, but I wonder if there are those kind of changes. So, interesting questions. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are wrapping around and bringing it all together in terms of, we talked about the development and release of gametes for the female. We talked about the development and release of gametes for the male. And so now we're going to discuss when they come together. All right. So, intercourse has deposited the sperm cells within to the vagina. They're going to be propelling themselves after, right? Remember we have that coagulating enzymes. And then the liquefying enzymes releasing those sperm cells. So sperm cells are now swimming on their own, going from the vagina, going up into the cervix. We're losing some along the way. You are losing all kinds of numbers of sperm cells along the way, right? Whether some of them are just not made properly. Some of them have two heads and they're like, oh, some of them have no head. Some of them aren't swimming well. They're just sitting there, right? You do mass production of anything. If you think about at a factory or something like that, if you whip things through, there's a lack of quality there. And so that definitely happens with the sperm cells, right? So many millions and billions that are produced. You get some that are not going to be functional. Some that also then don't make it to the cervix. So a smaller number make it to the cervix. Now also, right, the inner lining of the vagina is somewhat acidic. It's supposed to be a first layer of defense, right? When we were first and second and third line of defense, that's a first layer of defense right there. So some of the sperm cells are going to die off because of that. Some are going to be attacked by like macrophages and phagocytes and things like that. But some make it into the cervix. Some make it up into the uterus, right? Now the question is, when we get to the top of the uterus, you got a choice, right? We don't know which of the ovaries is releasing the egg, but it's only one of them on average. So there's quite the possibility that a number of them just take a wrong turn and go the other uterine tube, and there's nothing there waiting for them. So you lose a lot like that. They do think that there are some chemical signals, as we've seen through time, right? Through like cuts healing and growth and things like that, that maybe there's some chemical signals that may help to lead them in a certain direction, but you're still going to lose some that way. So they're going up into the uterine tube. And in general, for successful pregnancy to occur, fertilization is going to occur within about 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. Okay? Now think of our cycles here. In the ovarian cycle, we've got a follicular phase, we've got ovulation, and we have the luteal phase. So ovulation, on average, is in the middle of that 28-day cycle. The uterine cycle is also on a 28-day cycle. So we are doing the menstruation and the proliferation, and then there's ovulation. Now we're in the secretory phase. We've got to get a signal. If a pregnancy is going to be maintained, we've got to get a signal back to the uterus before it goes into the menstrual phase, right? That's like one of those like Mission Impossible movies where they're like waiting to like pull the pin or something like that, and they have to coordinate it. They're like, I haven't heard anything. Do we do it now? Do we do it now? It has to be coordinated just right. If the uterus doesn't get that signal, then it's going to go into menstruation. And even though maybe fertilization occurred, pregnancy or implantation is not going to occur, right? So you won't have a pregnancy. All right, so this is about the 14th day right here, right? So maybe about the 15th day or so is when that fertilization might occur. Usually in about that first third of the uterine tube. That's where most commonly fertilization occurs. In the uterine tube, for sure, and then in that first third, right after the fimbriae. Because after that, what's going to happen is we're going to see the nuclei of the two gametes combine. And that's where we get our zygote, right? That's our 2N diploid cell. Then we're going to start going through our mitotic divisions, right? Because we've got to make a whole bunch of cells. We've got to hurry, get to the morula, get to the blastula, so that we can start figuring out what's going to be the embryo, what's going to be the amnion, etc. So those divisions are occurring in the days after fertilization, and as that early embryo is migrating towards the uterus, right? 2 cell, 4 cell, 8, 16, etc. So by about day 3 to 4, we're in that morula, solid ball of cells, 16, 32, 64 cell. All the cells look the same. They're all diploid, but they all look the same. We're just generating a bunch so that we have enough to start then allocating, after cleavage is occurring, to the blastula or the blastocyst when we start differentiating it. So that's what is arriving here in the uterus, is the blastula or the blastocyst, where we have that cavity. Once we have that cavity, there's a space in there. Now it graduates from a morula to a blastula. And that's when we start, right after that, we go to this thing that's called the gastrula, which is where, again, where we see that like embryonic disc, and the yolk sac and the amniotic sac and what's going to become the placenta and stuff like that, right? So we see cell fate or determination of certain cells becoming certain things. But look at this. So this is day 6 to 7 after fertilization. So in terms of the cycle, this is like day 21 of the cycle. This was like day 14 of the cycle there. This is a week later. So a week later, about, the blastula or the blastocyst is starting to embed within that endometrium, right? Where we're going to have the decidua basalis and all that type of thing that we were learning before. So the interesting thing about that is, right, 28-day cycle, we've got about a week for that blastula to implant and start releasing some sort of a signal to let the mother's body know that pregnancy has been achieved and we need to maintain that endometrial lining, right? So it's not a lot of time. So if it occurs too late, if, for instance, our fertilization occurs here, there's not a lot of time for it to go through all these cleavage stages and reach the blastula stage when we can start developing cells that will start growing into chorionic villi and becoming the placenta and stuff like that, right? It's going to be too late, even though that fertilization has occurred. Okay, so what's going to happen? We have that blastula that's arrived there at about day 21 or so. And the blastula or the blastocyst stage is when we start seeing different cells becoming different things, right? The outer layer of cells, like we saw in the model, is called the trophoblast. And that trophoblast starts secreting this. So this is human chorionic gonadotropin. So we know a trophic hormone is going to go signal some other endocrine gland, right? So human chorionic gonadotropin, if we look at the parts of that, human, that's pretty straightforward. Chorion. So chorionic villi, remember chorionic villi are the beginning little root-like structures that are going to become the placenta. So in essence, this placenta is not only going to be allowing the exchange of nutrients and water and respiratory gases and all of that, but it's also going to be releasing hormones to maintain that pregnancy. So it's kind of going to take over for the corpus luteum that has been maintaining the uterine lining, and it will start secreting hormones as well. And the very first hormone that it puts out in the early stages is human chorionic gonadotropin. So this one is going to go into the female circulation. This is a hormone that's going to enter into the mother's circulation. And this is going to go into that feedback loop and, right, hypothalamus to pituitary gland, going to tell the ovaries, oh, let's maintain that corpus luteum. Let's keep releasing that progesterone, which maintains the endometrial lining. Okay? So that's the signal that says, yep, I'm here. Don't go into the menstruation. Don't shut us out because we have achieved pregnancy and there's something here that needs to be maintained. Okay? So that HCG is what is being tested for in the pregnancy kits, right? So when you're peeing on the stick or whatever, that's what they're testing for. And they talk about how early that can be tested, right? Those levels of that hormone coming from the blastula have to be high enough to reach back to the hypothalamus and to the mother's circulation to have an effect on their circulation. So it also makes sense, like we said, right? Hormones are going and circulating around. They can be inactivated. We can stop producing them. Also, we can lose them by being excreted out, by being urinated out, right? Because they can get filtered. They can drop through the glomerulus if they're small enough. So some of this, while it's going around in the bloodstream and maintaining the pregnancy, gets filtered out in the glomerulus and ends up in the urine. So that's why you can test that and be able to see that you're pregnant. Question here, and then coming around. Were you first? Sorry.
Okay. So the corpus luteum, is that pretty much like the relay station during the pregnancy, and it maintains during the whole pregnancy to send the signals, or is there a point when it dissipates and stops its involvement?
So that's a good question. I don't know exactly what point. It's kind of that tipping point where the placenta is handling everything, but the placenta is a significant organ that does end up releasing a whole bunch of different hormones. And so it kind of takes over, but I don't know when the corpus luteum kind of tags out and says, okay, you got this. Okay. I'm not sure.
But it's pretty much in the early stages. It's the one sending and receiving and basically telling everybody what else to do.
Yeah, the corpus luteum. Right. So it's trickling down to the ovary, but the ovary has that corpus luteum that's maintained, and that's what's keeping the uterus on track. Yeah. Recent.
So is that how the possibility of a false negative could happen is because it might not go through the urine, so it's hard to catch or there's not enough in the urine?
It's a possibility, right? So, yeah, I mean, any urine sample, there's going to be, as we were talking about when we were doing urinary system, the urine concentration varies as well, right? So if you're well hydrated or whatever, then you're kind of diluting the urine, so maybe there's not quite enough to pick it up. And then there's a little bit of a cycle and stuff like that, so that's possible, yeah.
So with IVF,
Mm-hmm.
could they be injecting like a hormone supplement like that?
Right.
To like help the uterus?
Exactly so, right? So with in vitro fertilization, where they are physically doing the implantation, there isn't that cycle, right? So at some point it'll get up and running, that it will establish, and again, I always think about the plant seed growing roots and then establishing its own connection and then developing and releasing hormones and stuff like that. But early on, we don't have that feedback loop, that normal feedback loop. And so for sure, injections of progesterone in order to maintain that is going to be important. I'm sure there's other ones too, maybe, right? Because we'll see there's other hormone levels that increase as well. Yeah.
So why is there a higher possibility of having twins with IVF?
So that's a good question. Some of the different, right, so with IVF and stuff like that, they'll develop a number of embryos and they'll often implant more than one embryo. Because that way, they're just kind of like, if you will, how the male produces a bunch of sperm, because like some of them aren't going to make it. In this case, right, if we're going to start into the pregnancy, then they usually will implant more than one embryo, because sometimes, for whatever reason, it just won't form the connection. It won't implant successfully. Now, if they're lucky, right, maybe everyone they put in there implants, but through time, they've been gathering the data in terms of I don't know what that number is, like how the percentage success rate in terms of implantation and successful pregnancy. And there's enough of those early embryos that don't successfully continue to grow that they think that they kind of need those backups in there instead. Now, the other thing is that sometimes if the woman is having a hard time getting pregnant, right? Well, we have to look at, okay, what's the early stages? Like, is the gametogenesis happening in both individuals, right? Is the male producing enough sperm? Are those sperm capacitated, right, active enough to be swimming to making this trek, et cetera, right? We know that, right, there's temperature that affects gametogenesis and stuff like that in the male, as we were discussing. And then we have to look at the female, and are the hormone levels varying appropriately to where we're actually ovulating and things like that. Then, if that's not occurring, there are some drugs that can increase our ovulation, right? And who knows? I don't know for sure. It may be a variant of luteinizing hormone, right? So you get a little extra pop of external luteinizing hormone. Now, and there would still have to be a little bit of follicle stimulating hormone if you think about it, because we would have to tell the ovaries, okay, now let's kick it up. Let's develop a few more, and then luteinizing hormone to tell them to pop out. You're just kind of hoping to get it to a normal level where ovulation for whatever reason isn't occurring. But maybe you don't know what that level is, so maybe you overshoot it, and now boop, boop, you've gotten more than one egg being released. And of course, you're going to have more than one sperm that's being deposited, so you may have the possibility of twins or more at that point too, just because now we stimulate the ovaries and they did their job on the other side and ended up releasing more than one. So, yeah.
It's also just cost efficient as well, because if you're just implanting already, it's not so just.
Yeah, that's right. If you're going to be like the baby factory there, let's like go through the process and do it more than once.
What if you can get the hormones regulated just right?
Yeah.
At least one time for your uterus to stabilize that pregnancy.
Right, because for whatever reason that woman's having a hard time overall, and so it's going to be hard to say whether you kind of get that sweet spot in terms of hormonal regulation again. Yeah, it's possible. In fact, that's how my twins were born. So my wife was having a hard time, we were having a hard time conceiving, so she took some of, like we were talking about, like kind of like follicle stimulating hormone, et cetera, just to kind of get to a normal level. And then, hey, guess what? Did a good job. You have two. So our first kids were twins. So we have twin girls who are 21 now, who are graduating in 10 days or something like that. One's graduating from ASU, one's graduating from NAU. So we started out with two there. And then interestingly enough, like a year and a half later, our son was born, no problem. So we like kick-started her ovarian cycle or whatever, and then all of a sudden it was up and running. And then we had one other son that was born here. So 4 kids overall. Okay. So let's see, what else? What we were saying there is the placenta, as it develops, we go from chorionic villi and chorion to a full-on placenta. It is going to take over maintaining the pregnancy, and it's going to release a variety of different hormones to do so. So you can see, for instance, lactogen for breast development, like prolactin, is going to aid in that. More estrogens as well. So estrogens coming from the ovary, look, that's what we were just talking about, right? So if the follicles are not developing, the follicles also are not developing during pregnancy because we paused that whole thing. But here comes the placenta sliding in there and says, oh, I know that's going to be low. So it's going to take over those and maintain those estrogen levels. So in a pregnancy, you have this other organ, the placenta, that's going to take over that normal cycle like that. And then there's a few other hormones that end up kind of bumping up their secretion as well. Aldosterone. So aldosterone, we know, tells the kidneys to hold on to sodium, which allows us to reabsorb water more. And we know that there's going to be more water that's going to be necessary for the development of the amniotic fluid, right? And all of the liquids and tissues and things like that inside of the embryo. That's all coming from the mother. And so increased aldosterone is going to be critical. Increased parathyroid hormone to maintain high calcium levels because you're going to be creating bone and things like that, etc. So a lot of different hormones that are going to increase because we're now supporting 2 individuals versus 1. So as we continue on, our early embryo that we said was a zygote, then it was a morula, then it was a blastula, then technically it was a gastrula, we'll see that, where we're starting to see different cell fates. That embryonic stage goes until the 8-week period. We mentioned that in lab. So 8-week for humans is your dividing line between embryo, when they all kind of look the same, chicken, lizard, human, versus the fetal stage, where it's obvious that you have this human vertebrate that's developing there. So 8th week is when we transition over. And in fact, during those 8 and then continued, whatever up to 36 weeks-ish, a lot of what's going on during that fetal stage is really just kind of increased complexity. So what we'll find is, right, so here is where we see the gastrula, where we see certain cells becoming certain things, amnion versus yolk sac versus the embryonic disc there with the different germ cell layers. We can see our chorionic villi that are starting to grow like roots, kind of growing into that endometrium. So that on the right-hand side is going to be our decidua basalis over there versus the decidua capsularis on the left side. And then that's going to continue growing. And once we hook up those chorionic villi, then things are really going to accelerate. But even by the 4th week, right? 4th week, heart's beating, head and jaws appear, and limb buds form. That early cell, the embryo model that we saw there, that's as early as the 4th week. Now, think about this. We were talking about the ovarian, the uterine cycle. Ovulation was about day 14, maybe fertilization day 15. So the last 2 weeks of the female reproductive cycle is the first 2 weeks about the embryonic lifespan, right? So when we say 4 weeks there, that's basically like 2 weeks after the first missed period. So 2 weeks, depending on what's going on, 2 weeks late, you're aware of it, but who knows? Finals are going on, something like that. You're like, there's some stress here, so things are a little irregular. Might not be obvious to you. Meanwhile, the embryo at 4 weeks already has functioning organs going on, right? So there's that much development going on during the embryonic period compared to later on when we get to the fetal period. But like we said, as those chorionic villi continue to make a hookup with the female circulatory system, now we're going to see a big acceleration, right? So we have the chorion that's going to become the placenta, and the amnion that is going to become the amniotic cushioning fluid, and then our umbilical cord that is going to connect to the placenta with our 2 umbilical arteries and our 1 umbilical vein. So at this stage that we see here, about that 4 weeks or so, we can see the yolk sac is starting to shrink, right? That's our sac lunch that we've been feeding on already. But now we're starting to get a direct connection through those chorionic villi and the continued establishment of that placenta. So from that 8th week then, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
On the previous set of number slides, it went from 2 to 7 or something like that. 2 to 4. Is there supposed to be, right here, is there something supposed to be in between that?
That's a good question. I'd have to take a look at that myself to see if there was something there. Send me a reminder email.
Okay.
I doubt if it's anything critical.
Yeah, just
Well, we'll
a
double check.
a number mischanged
Right.
there. Okay.
All right, so I know we're at the very last stage here. We're at the very last stage of the pregnancy as well. So this leads to our actual delivery. So in this case, what we have is that big surge in oxytocin that's coming from the posterior pituitary, right? Released from the posterior pituitary, its main role is to cause smooth muscle contractions along the uterus. And also, we've got relaxin that is starting to relax the cervix as well, allow it to dilate, to usher not only the baby down towards the cervix, but to open up that cervix and provide an exit point for the baby itself. And remember that this, in terms of that feedback, it's one of the few examples of positive feedback in the body. All the time we were learning about these hormones and about homeostasis and how we're nudging it back with negative feedback. If there's a change, we nudge it back to the set point. Change, nudge it back. This is one of the few cases where we have positive feedback. As those contractions continue, right, we have mechanoreceptors there that are stretching, sends signals back to the hypothalamus, which causes the release of more oxytocin, where you get more and more frequent and more intense contractions until the baby is actually birthed. But the deal there is that we're going from maintaining one individual in homeostasis. For a while we've maintained 2, and now we're going back to a set point where we're just maintaining 1. So we're shifting the homeostatic set point. So that positive feedback is like amplifying up in order to eject the baby, to birth the baby, and go back to just maintaining the one adult. So it's a unique situation that requires that positive feedback. Okay, that's it. That is the whole body in 2 semesters. Now you know everything.